Hey, you guys, my name is Nicolas Mercado, and I'm here with my peers. Go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Mariana Gonzalez.
And I am Nacheli Rodriguez.
And today we're going to be presenting for our mass communication class, the history of radio. So proceeding forward, we're going to slide 2. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and talk about the emergence of radio technology. It was basically the telegraph that was made in the 1840s. It was just a bunch of dashes and dots. Basically, we have an example here that I'm going to go ahead and show you guys. But it was known as the precursor of radio technology. It was sent by electrical impulses from point A to point B, meaning it's a sender and a receiver. But there was 3 cons with it that we're going to go ahead and highlight here. You couldn't hear voices. They could also be misinterpreted. And the range was very limited, only where there was wiring at. So we're going to go ahead and show you the video of what the example was right here. And we're going to go ahead and go up to A and up to C. So. Okay, so that's A, B, and C. Again, like they're just electrical impulses. It was dots and dashes, but they had a whole alphabet and a numerical code for it. So moving on to the second slide. All right, now we're going to talk about how the wireless telegraphy came in by Mr. Marconi. He was a 20-year-old Italian who looked over Hertz's work to create this wireless telegraphy. He's also known as the father of radio, and he would later his devices would be installed into ships for long-range communications. But this is Mr. Marconi besides his wireless telegraph. Going on to the next slide. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and talk about Lee D. Forrest. Lee D. Forrest was a scholar, an innovator, and an inventor. He was more known as an innovator, if anything. He would later create wireless telephoning that emphasized wireless voice and music, and ultimately became radio. He also created the Audion, which is basically the amplification in a vacuum tube to receive while receiving radio signals. This would basically make it sound a lot better than it used to sound. And this would basically be the pushing point for radio to become a mass medium. And right here in the picture, we also have him standing next to an Audion transmitter. I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next slide. Okay, new motivation. Right here, we're just talking about how, for most people that know the Titanic, it was underlining the Wireless Ship Act of 1910. This is just meaning that because of that tragic event, now the Radio Act of 1912 came into play, and it transversed from the Wireless Ship Act to the Radio Act, which basically means there's a universal Morse code distress signal, and and it addressed the problem of cramming airwaves disrupting communications caused by amateur operators. Basically, people who didn't really know how to use it, and they made sure that there was professionals behind the telegraph, just to make sure that there wasn't any miscommunication or anything like that, and there was professionals behind it. And this also transitioned the radio to a natural resource, meaning that it's supposed to be beneficial for society and have a better outcome in the end. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next one. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about how World War I came into the capitalization of the GE and the AT&T corporations. So basically, Marconi had a corporation in the UK and it had a branch into the United States. And because of World War I, it grew tensions with the US Navy. So AT&T and GE saw this opportunity to take advantage of the US Navy's paranoia and capitalize on it. So they ended up being the leading corporation in the radio industry above Marconi's corporation. So we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, now we're going to talk about the impact, what it really impacted. We can talk about, or we are going to talk about the golden age of radio, which is between the 1920s and the 1930s, and some would say even more throughout the years. But basically, this was the growing of popularity shows on radio stations. This would vary from farm reports, commentary, weather forecasts, soap operas, parlor games, and they were mostly live broadcasts. And we're going to talk about the examples in the next slide. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. And right here, we're just going to name a few examples from the 1920s and the 1940s. Amos and Andy, The Shadow, The Lone Ranger, The Green Hornet, Fiber McGee and Molly. These are just a few of the shows that were broadcasted. And these broadcasts were also on a weekly basis, a certain time, and people will gather around to listen for 15 minutes to 30 minutes long. And usually they were with CBS, NBC, Red or Blue, that broadcasted these radio shows. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass the baton to Mariano here for the next 7 slides, and he'll go ahead and take care of the rest.
So now we're going to talk about the monopoly on telephone businesses in 1922. AT&T historically argued that telephone service was a natural monopoly and that the competition was inefficient. As the competitive era of telephone service came to a close, AT&T was successful in its argument and was able to establish itself as a government-sanctioned monopoly. In 1922, Alexander Graham Bell, the creator of the telephone, died, and by the time of his death, there was 13 million telephones in operation. So basically, AT&T, it argued, that, hey, it's not our fault that the telephone industry is not very big right now. And so it was able to maintain its very big company, and which was considered to be a monopoly, but this time it was a government sanctioned monopoly, so it was still protected by the government. Next slide, please. In this slide, we talk about the ending of the communication monopoly in the 1930s. So in the early 1930s, the Federal Trade Commission had said that the RCA had several violations of antitrust laws. So, and regardless of these violations, the FTC let the monopoly continue. It was around 1930 that the federal government charged the RCA and NBC with violations of having too much power over manufacturing and programming. After these violations, the RCA decided that, okay, you know what, we're going to propose a plan to the federal government. It proposed to buy all of GE, Westinghouse, and other major manufacturing businesses. This allowed for the case against RCA to be dismissed, and the federal government and RCA both came into an agreement, and this allowed RCA to break up the monopoly. Next slide, please. We have the Radio Act of 1927. So the Radio Act of 1927, it was passed by Congress, and this stated that the licensees did not own their own channels. This act created the Federal Radio Commission, and then we talk about the Communication Act of 1934. This act ultimately was a Radio Act, but included other mass communications such as telephones and the telegraphs. It also changed the name from Federal Radio Commission to Federal Communication Commission. So yeah, next slide, please. Transition from AM radio to FM radio in the 1930s. So Edwin Armstrong was the one who had this revolutionary breakthrough. He feared that the downfall of radio when televisions were up and coming, and so that's when he proposed this new idea of FM radio. Edwin Armstrong was also known as the most prolific and influential inventors in radio history. FM radio used frequency modulation, that's where we get the name FM, which was preferably for music with fidelity and clarity, while AM radio used amplitude modulation, which put stress on radio waves. It also introduced the first FM stations commercially with RCA. As we know, it was the company that held a lot of power in the radio industry, and Edwin Armstrong would eventually commit suicide because of the amount of stress put on Armstrong's journey with FM radio. Now we're just going to hear a little bit of how AM and FM radio sounded like. So the first one you heard was AM and the second one was FM. In this slide, we talk about the portable radios in the 1940s. So in 1947, the company Bell Laboratories created transistors. Basically, these were small electrical devices that could pick up radio signals. This became known as portable radios, and people would just take them everywhere because they were just so small and very durable. You could take these to the beach, you could take these to your bedroom, anywhere where you could just carry them, you could take these and just listen to the radio at any time you please. So the top 40s format in the 1950s and 1960s. So in 1938, a lot of the music that was being shown on the radio was either live or it was recorded. And this accounted for a total of 48% of all programming, meaning that 48% of all radio stations in the United States were playing either live music or recorded music. In the mid 1950s, there was management control idea that combined the rock and roll genres and came up with the top 40 format. So basically the top 40 is a chart that ranks the top 40 songs that are being sold. So for example, if you have one song that is selling a certain amount of copies, and let's say it sells 10,000 copies, it has a possibility of going number one on the top 40, meaning it's the most popular song that is being bought right now. So that's really just what the top 40 is. Continuation of the top 40. So with the development of FM radio in the mid 1960s, this allowed for the experimenting of music on the radio. So FM radio stations began playing different types of music, such as classical music, jazz, blues, and other rock songs that weren't necessarily on the top 40. These types of music were heard all over the United States. They were experimenting and they just added a variety and different genres to the different stations. These radio stations were also talking about different things that were going on during that time period, for example, such as the civil rights movement and the involvement of the US in the Vietnam War. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now for the evolution, new radio technology of the 2000s. During the 2000s, several advancements in technology allow radio to be much more available. From the portable radios to the 2000s, technological advancements allow radios to be broadcast through satellites and the internet. Starting at the late 1990s, the digital transmissions started to be applied to broadcasting. Next slide, please. Advertisements. During the years, radio advertisement increased, is spending more than $20,000 for a simple 15-second radio advertisement. In the 2000s, $21,000 were spent for radio advertisement. And in 2006, $21,000 were spent. 22 were spent making those 2 years the ones in which more people ever pay for radio advertisement. Meanwhile, the non-profit radio depend on private or government fund for stability, mostly of the FM bandwidth, also known as the non-commercial radio. More known non-profit radio stations include PVC and NPR. Had to be approved under the provisions of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 and under the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Payola through the years. Payola is the illegal practice where record promoters pay DJs to play specific songs. Payola was very prominent during the 1950s, paying DJs to play specific songs has a huge impact on the music industry. This leads to songs being energetic, meaning that the people are not actually fans of the songs, but they are forced to hear it on the radio. Payola has been around for a very, very long time, with technology involving Payola has evolved alongside with it. Radio ownership allowed for companies and individuals to own radio stations, created a large market for expanding ownerships over radio stations. And those radio stations examples are included as iHeartMedia, Univision, and CBS Radio. Also, pirate radio, freelancers who would broadcast on low power FM and with low range frequencies were repressed by the NAB because of the included religious groups, schools, labor groups, Native American tribes, missions, and farmers. The radio influence on the public now is that the radio is now available for everyone, and it's everywhere, and it's wherever you go and whenever you want it. Most importantly, you have millions and millions of stations and options to hear. Radio became a vital link to information and had the power to influence people's opinion in a way that had never been seen before. People could find out what was happening in the world quickly after it happened, and it was much faster than waiting for the newspaper to print a story.
Go ahead.
I personally think that due to social media now, we don't really pay as much attention as the radio as back in the years. In the 1960s, in the 1970s, the radio wasn't for everyone or for anyone. And now that we have it for anyone and everywhere, we take it for granted thanks to social media.
I agree with that. I think that if social media wasn't as prominent as it is now, I think that we would be relying a lot more on radio stations to find our news, especially because it is just found everywhere. For example, you can just get in the car and you can just turn on the radio stations. We can also just be having like in the other slides, the portable radios. And so I do think that radios nowadays, I think it created a path for like social media and like and how to be like and like stay connected with each other.
For me, I find it fascinating that radio has gone such a long way from just being a telegraph, dots and dashes, to actually hearing voices, podcasts, everything nowadays, right? And I also think it's interesting to see how it's going to evolve from how it is now. What more can they do with radio? What more could they do with broadcasting, and et cetera, et cetera. But it's very we live in a day and age where technology is everywhere mostly, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it'll evolve and how it'll impact the economy 20 years down the road, or if it'll have any impact. But we'll see. But for right now, I guess radio, we have most of us have access to it. Applications like Pandora, Spotify, Amazon Music, everything like iTunes have their own radio stations. It's so-called your own radio stations that they create for you, and it's just very different from what we had back then. But yeah, that concludes what my inputs are, my opinions.
And I think that with that concludes our entire presentation. So thank you so much for watching and hearing us present about this topic. And we hope that you learned a lot about radio. Thank you.